Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I have been an academic as well as a lawyer and a strategist and someone working in the environment space for about 30 years. And 2 years ago, I sort of gave up my visiting professorship at UCL. And some of that was to do with not being very organised and resubmitting my application for it to be renewed. But I think emotionally, it was to do with the fact that I felt like as an academic, the response for me to be in an ecological crisis wasn't to write another book or to write more peer-reviewed literature. And I felt that actually talking to people and being much more of an activist and joining, especially those movements that are taking bolder action, was what I thought was right. And it was based on evidence and literature and also understanding how fundamental social change happens. But I'm trying now to connect with, the students who I used to talk to and have the privilege of teaching, and to do that with as many invitations that I can accommodate in my schedule as possible. So I miss you guys. You're really, really, really important. The work that you're doing is important. The understanding that you're doing is important. And it's not that I think that learning isn't important or academic institutions are not important. We're all called upon to do more. And I guess if there's one big message that I want you to take away from today, it's that both in our professional lives and in our personal lives, we have to do more, and we have to break down those silos, that we've kind of operated in the past, where we've boxed ourselves in, and each and every one of us has to become a disruptor and an activist in some way. You don't all have to join me in Extinction Rebellion or join whatever way of disruption you feel comfortable with and you are called to. I belong also to Greenpeace UK as a board member. I am a board member of Julie's Bicycle, an arts-based creative charity that supports artists and the cultural sector. I work also in my local community. So there's lots of ways in which I feel my activism is shaping and helping and supporting me fight the climate and ecological crisis that we're in. And I hope the big picture message, however rambly I get, is for you to also think and do something different, because each and every one of us on the planet is required to think and do something different at this moment in time. We're at a crossroads, ecologically and especially in our political systems. Our political systems were sort of settled, and right now they're in flux. And it's good that they're in flux, because the complacent sort of way in which they were operating was very much destroying nature and causing inequality to widen. So I welcome the fact that many different movements are now working together for a much more fundamental change in both our financial, ecological, social, and our political systems. I think right now we're at a point where we can choose a storyline which results in yet more ecological and possible societal collapse, even of countries that are relatively stable and have got a lot of resilience in terms of assets and robust laws. There's increasing, as I said, inequality among and between countries. Mass migration is happening. Starvation and increased wars are fueling that. We can choose harder borders, secularization, securitization, and militarization of our societies as people fight over natural resources to secure them for us and leave an ever larger a number of people that we choose to call them to fend for themselves. And this concept of borders is very much, what those who are invested in business as usual are using to try and divide and rule and to try and kind of manage the way in which the collapse happens, that it's okay, the collapse will happen over there, you don't have to worry about it, we'll be okay here. You can choose to see that path, you can choose that storyline of competition over natural resources and securing it for the privileged few, as it were, or you can choose to see, as I do, the earth as abundant with the possibility of our economies being reshaped to provide clean air, clean water, clean energy, food, water, with no one being left behind. And that's the vision that's at the heart of what the UN adopted also nearly 5 years ago, called the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 interrelated goals, the vision of which is that we pursue them all together and we try and leave no country, no human being behind. We already, luckily, have all of the technologies, we have the know-how, we have the connectivities to ensure that we can secure that. We didn't used to have that. Like 10 years ago, we didn't have, solar energies, we didn't have renewable energies, we didn't have the capacity to generate and use battery storage, we weren't connected globally as a community. We have actually got many of the technologies in place that can create this shift. We have also got a fundamental understanding of what are the big picture things that need to happen. On an individual level, I sort of summarize them now, what can you do individually and with your family, your immediate family. The 4 Fs, food, you can shift to a plant-based diet as much as you can. Shifting, you don't have to shift to 7 days a week or become a vegan, but actually moving to a predominantly plant-based diet is going to massively reduce emissions, so food. Fashion has a footprint in greenhouse gas terms as large as Russia, so you can stop buying clothes, start swapping clothes, start recycling clothes, start upcycling clothes. You can reduce your flights. The 3rd F, most flights are taken by 10 to 15% of the richest people in the country and the richest people in the globe. Most flights are under 500 kilometers. Around half of the world's commercial flights are 500 kilometers or less. There are alternatives, ways of organizing our holidays, our leisure activities, our business activities to take care of those. And finance. So the 4th F is finance. In the end, all of the entire banking sector, all of the financial assets that are created and traded and sit at the centre of the heart of the UK's economy, they come from that £1 that you deposit in the bank, from that £10, from the £100. That's our money. The banking system creates value from your assets. So the more quickly you can divest, invest in cleaner alternatives, the better. That is our money that is there. And obviously finance you can also look at in terms of where your money goes to locally. What is your council spending its money on? What is the national government spending its money on? Where is our budget going? Where are the fossil fuel subsidies, which is a technical term. So the simplification of that is government handouts. Every year, since the Paris Agreement, we've handed out $1.9 trillion of government handouts globally to these industries, to the fossil fuel industries. So a trillion is, one with 12 noughts following it. It's a lot of noughts. There's a lot of money. A million is 6, a billion is 9, a trillion is 12. And it's really important to start understanding maths and big numbers. So these are big numbers, 1.9 trillion, since the Paris Agreement came into force, going to already the most profitable companies in the world. So Saudi Aramco, state-owned oil company, earns around $3,000 per second. It earns 300 million in profits a day. That's a day. These are vast numbers. I think we've forgotten how vast the fossil fuel economy and how embedded it is. And I guess for my personal story, I started off life thinking back in the very early 90s, we can create laws to regulate and adjust markets, and we can, diminish and lessen pollution. When I qualified as a lawyer in 1991, we didn't have many of the laws actually that you're probably studying in many of your master's courses. Most of them have been created as globally, since the early 90s. Some very old pieces of legislation will have been there from the 70s when there was this initial first flurry of understanding of the interconnectedness and interdependence and our human dependence on nature. There are now, I think, 1,200 laws. The other Grantham tracks them, I think. The LSE grant have a database on climate change, and most of those laws have come about in the last decade and a half. And none of those laws are consistent with what the world scientists have said is a safer pathway for humanity, which is embodied in this 1.5 degree limit that is enshrined in Paris, or at least governments, said that they would strive for. So well below 2 degrees to something 1.5, which is what the small island countries that I represented were arguing for, and which the island countries had been requesting for 10 years. So I was there in one of the climate change UN conferences. They're called COPs, the Conference of the Parties of the UN climate change meetings. And the first COP at which the 1.5 limit was put forward was 2009, and it was in Copenhagen. It was called COP15. And COP15 collapsed in acrimony because one of the flashpoints for us, the small island countries that I was working very closely with and have done for 25 years, they refused to put in a legally binding document. And as lawyers, we were like, no, you can't do that. We refused to put the 2 degree limit in without a reference to a review of it to the 1.5. So there was 110 countries in Copenhagen that said they would reject the deal that was being concocted at that time for us by the US and the larger developing country economies, China, India, and behind the scenes rejected that compromise unless there was an explicit reference that the UN system would look at 1.5. That was 2009. And I'm telling you about that because I just did a podcast and was asked what was the trigger for me in the end joining Extinction Rebellion and gluing myself to the headquarters of Shell. It was when the IPCC, the UN Science Panel, came out in October 2018. October 2018, that's 9 years later after Copenhagen, and issued its findings on the difference in terms of impacts on people and the planet of 2 degrees versus 1.5. And I remember the day that it came out, and I was sort of in tears. I'd actually read most of the report before because it had been leaked, and most of it was based on science papers that I'd been reading. But the difference between these two small numbers is vast. It's hundreds of millions of people who go into additional stress and are unable to have access to water. Huge parts of already fragile systems, coral reefs that cannot cope with existing temperature, literally being boiled. Huge numbers of people that suffer from additional food security, millions of people. You can look them up. They have some very good graphics. So what was one of the triggers was that report coming out in October 2018. Extinction Rebellion did their big protest at the very last day of October 2018. They had what I thought was a fitting response from community and scientists, a fitting response to that level of gravity of impacts, that level of tardiness in our political and economic systems to decade after decade of scientific evidence. I thought that the right response to it was to protest. It was to lie down outside the streets of Downing Street as the initial rebellion started in Downing Street in Parliament, just outside Downing Street. And it wasn't just to have another report from NGOs or another side event at a COP. It wasn't to have yet another conference. It wasn't to have yet another stakeholder seminar with the oil companies or the big agriculture companies say, come and sit at the table and talk about this problem, because we'd been doing that for 3 decades. I'd been doing that for 3 decades. I'd been writing policy report after policy report. I'd been reading report after report, including, many of you will have heard the Stern Review. Have you heard of that? Yeah, I see some nodding faces. Do you remember what year that was? It was I think 2007. So it was, another, 13 years ago, whatever we are sort of in. And there were lots and lots of other reports with distinguished economists, the IPCC itself, that said acting on climate will cost 1% to 2% of GDP in the long run, but the benefits are enormous. So the number of reports I've read that do the climate action is beneficial and it only costs 1% to 2% of GDP is a lot. And the Climate Change Committee last year came out in May and actually said going to net zero now was going to cost the same as the UK's original 80% reductions target by 2050. It shows the economics are changing, but roughly we've known that it will cost some amount of GDP, but actually we will gain so much in terms of GDP, in terms of human beings who are losing their lives, and there is no way in which GDP measures really now captures. It never has done, and it was never supposed to, but it doesn't capture, the grief, the anxiety, the extinction of millions of species. I think, it's very vivid now that what's happening in Australia has kind of made it very visible for people. What's happened in the Amazon over the last summer has made it very visible for people that there's no way in which GDP can really accurately measure or capture or compensate for what is happening in terms of the devastation to our planet and the people who are the frontline defenders and the communities. So thousands of homes in Australia are affected. You imagine, your entire house, the love and vision that you've put into it, all of those memories are gone. There's no way in which GDP sort of captures that. And I guess it took a lot of time, to really say that the way in which we've been teaching economics, the way in which we think about development, the word development itself, what does it mean, to think about how our political system and to question whether capitalism itself is really the cause of some of these bigger problems and whether we can reform it or revise it. Those are some of the questions that I've been thinking about, and I've come out very clearly thinking, no, they cannot be dealt with just in the context of my normal legal environmental lawyer sort of hat work. They require a much bigger, broader response from society and a real questioning and a real challenging of the status quo in terms of what we think of as success and what we think of as a functioning system. So I think very much if you look around right now, the ecological crisis and the economic crisis, the financial crisis, and are all coming together. I really feel that one of the hopeful things right now is the young strikers movements, Extinction Rebellion, many other movements that are fighting against all of those different fronts, and that they see their struggles as linked. They're all part of the same system, which is causing 5 million children in the UK to be living in poverty and to rely on food banks. So the same system that's causing that level of inequality and indifference to that is causing indifference and leaving large parts of the planet to fend for itself. Our soils here are depleted, our biodiversity here is depleted, and most of our woodlands in this country have gone. So we kind of think and like to talk about many other places, but actually if you look at agriculture in this country, if you look at the level of woodland cover, it's pretty appalling. We have in the UK the lowest level of woodland cover, despite 4 decades of hard planting by the Woodland Trust and many other charities and other voluntary efforts. And we're going to see more woodland planting, and that's a good thing. So I'm not criticizing that, but I am asking you to think, why are we in the UK, which looks kind of quite green when you fly over it, actually a biodiversity desert and one of the countries that has got the lowest level of biodiversity and of woodland cover? I think it's because we started industrialization here 300 years ago, and after enclosure and after very rapid development of fossil fuel-based industries in towns, we went to other countries and used up a lot of their resources, and the history of natural resource depletion goes hand in hand with the history of colonization and imperialism. And again, most people don't want to talk about that in the environment community. As soon as you add those words, colonialism, imperialism, everyone just sort of goes a bit quiet. They don't want to talk about the historical reasons why we're at the point of ecological collapse. And I increasingly want to talk about that because I come from one of the countries that was colonized. I'm a migrant, I'm a Muslim, my family left India, my mum and dad left India when they were young children and went to Pakistan. They're part of this history of a destructive, extractive cycle, and that cycle now is visiting many other parts of the world with horrible, ferocious intensity. You have now 4 to 7 environmental defenders, mainly indigenous peoples, whose lands are being encroached or are being subject to land grabs, who are being killed, who are murdered. The highest number of journalists who are feeling restrictions or who are, in some cases, being attacked are environmental journalists, journalists reporting on the environment. Yesterday you had, for the first time, 2 days ago, even in this country, restrictions on the press. Like no one was allowed to ask questions of the Prime Minister at the launch of the UK's climate strategy for, what is going to be a very amazing COP, one way or the other. It's going to be amazing. This UN conference that's going to be hosted, we think still in Glasgow, it's confirmed yesterday. So we have President Trump, who's been very selective and has been not answering, climate questions. We have a whole climate denial lobby very, very active in the digital spaces. We have what we call the Fox Murdoch effect. There's a book on that as well. So the English-speaking countries, the US, Australia, the UK in part, have had very high levels of climate denialism because we've had press ownership in the hands of climate-denying billionaires, and we still have. So these crises of the increase of billionaires, the shutting down of democratic spaces, the manipulation of our media, again, the good news is they're being challenged and exposed. And as I said, for the first time in this country, the number of the interest of the population in climate change outside of a big spike from a UN convention or whatever trigger is very, very high. What can we do about it? And what is the place of the UK in particular, and what is your place in responding to this crisis? Well, as you all know, climate change is one of the many different environmental treaties that is being negotiated this year. So I'm trying to simplify what I'm saying. But anyway, what we as in the environment governance space call it 2020 is a super year. So there are 4 big things that are happening, not just the Glasgow conference at the end in 2020. We have an oceans treaty that is being negotiated. We have a biodiversity treaty essentially that's being negotiated. That will be in China. The oceans treaty is in Lisbon. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the anniversary of the UN itself. And right at the end, in November, just a few days after the US election, we have the climate change summit in Glasgow. And the climate summit in Glasgow is essentially now supposed to result in countries submitting increased targets. That's what we call them in lay terms. We're not ever allowed to use them in legal terms. They're called nationally determined contribution, because the idea of target, the word target, was ditched from the climate legal regime back in 1994, because the US said we don't like the word targets. So we had to use, other legal jargon for that. We weren't allowed to use targets and the word timetable together. So those three words, were deleted. So sometimes people say, what do you do in your legal life? We sort of invent phrases to go around big problems, big political problems sometimes. So in Kyoto, we had quantified emissions reductions and limitation objectives, CELROs. So we're lovely at wonderful at inventing lovely acronyms in And obscuring the problem is that countries didn't really want to sign up to hard, legally binding targets and timetables. The biggest one was the US. Other countries did. And now in the Paris Agreement, we've gone back to an even fuzzier way of formulating the same thing, which is a national plan setting out your target, which is nationally determined contributions. And many of you will know the acronym NDCs. So countries in this year are supposed to submit their updated or enhanced NDC for aligning with the Paris goals of well below 2 degrees 1.5. They're also supposed to come up with other additional information to clarify that. And that's the heart of what the Glasgow conference was meant to be about. So the date by which these are submitted are not known. The format is still unclear. The degree of ambition, which is what most of you hear about, like how consistent are they, how ambitious are they really on track with that country's goal, let alone in aggregate with the global goals that we've set of 2 degrees 1.5. All of those are at the heart of the negotiations, and at the heart of them is this stark fact. I was in Madrid just in December, and essentially the world's poorest countries, around 110 countries now, most of the small islands, nearly all of the African countries, some other countries like Peru and Colombia and others, they've all said they're going to submit their updated or enhanced NDCs in line with net zero by 2050 goal, or have a long-term strategy that is aiming to get to that. That's what they said. And virtually none of the richer countries, none of the bigger countries have made that commitment. We have got now the EU finally getting there, but it's still unclear when the EU will deliver its updated, enhanced NDC. So, I'm talking a lot about the themes of unfairness. I'm talking a lot about the themes of historical responsibility. I'm talking a lot about fundamental changes in the way in which we expect leadership, the notion of leadership, to work, because the truth is that most of the larger countries, most of the richer countries, nearly all of the OECD, their emissions have not fallen in line with the expectations that scientists had set. They've not fallen in line with the expectations and the legal norms that were created. In some cases they have, but most of that reduction is due to outsourcing of emissions to other countries who are then exporting those goods and products back to us, like China. And so there is some, I don't want to say nothing has happened, that's not true, but by and large, we in the UK, in the EU, have outsourced our coal production and our dirty manufacturing to other countries, and we're asking them now to create a different set of societies, a different set of industrialization, a different set of well-being for their countries based on clean technology that we ourselves have not yet adapted, and we still want to consume all of the products at a cheaper price that they should. So it's literally passing the burden on to others to create a completely new society. So I've spoken for quite a long time. I think that what COP26, which will be my 24th COP, because I was at the first one in 1995. I had a 6-month-old baby just before that COP. She's now 25 and she recently got married. And so I really do feel very personally like I have skin in the game, and I feel the level of frustration with that system can only change if there's real pressure from everyone, from every single citizens, from every single borough, from every single city, from every single the Californias, every single what we call subnational actors. All of them have to push their governments, which are where the blockage kind of is. Each one is waiting for the other. The richer countries are blaming the poorer countries. The poorer countries are trying their best but need sort of resources. And I think there is hope because now around 1,300 cities and councils, including mine, Camden Council, have declared a climate and ecological emergency. This movement exploded last year, very largely as a result of many movements working to say that we needed to do more, we needed to act with a sense of emergency. there's around 800 million people covered by those authorities, actually, almost 1 billion. It's a pretty large number. And they're at differing degrees of implementation and, getting their plans in line with what that means. Most of them are adopting a 2030 timeframe for total or full total or near total decarbonisation. Many of them are increasingly seeing that climate justice and social justice are intrinsically linked, that you cannot, tinker around and impose the costs of action on citizens and those parts of society that are least able to bear the brunt of them, and in many cases have usually a disproportionately lower share of emissions. So in this country, likewise, in Camden, 60% of people don't own cars. So just talking about cars reduction and phasing out, diesel engines is not really speaking to the vast majority of people who don't own or use a car. And I'm looking a lot at many people here are younger who probably don't know how to drive. My children are like zero interested in owning cars and working out how to do them. So, touting this measure that we're going to phase out ICE, the internal combustion engine, is brilliant. It is good. But until you address public transport and mobility, and until you make our cities safe to walk, until you make cycling possible for everyone, until you invest in public transport, you're not going to get climate action that is fair and which is going to really seem beneficial and certainly lead to that 1 to 2%. I think you can also look at it from the point of view of housing and pollution. In Camden, we have a huge number of buildings which are really old, and the people who are suffering from the biggest bills, paying for heating and suffering from fuel poverty as well, are those who are generally the elderly and in the poorest income communities. So again, energy efficiency in social housing, energy efficiency of our entire entire stock of building, 30 million buildings that we have, very old in this country because we industrialised first, and nearly everyone lives in a house that's 50 years or 100 years old, which isn't the case in many other parts of the world. That is a top priority, and that again isn't a priority that this government currently has, and it's not seen as a climate kind of action. And in fact, transport and buildings are our biggest kind of emissions buckets, and which we could sort of very quickly bring these agendas together and bring people on board instead of seeing climate change as something that has to be separate. And it's something that we will do much later down the line. So I want to leave you with something very positive. Like I've done quite a lot of protesting. I feel like everyone should, divest, invest, protest, figure out what that looks like for you as an individual. Add the word disruptor to your CV, from day one. Say what you're going to do different. And what are the sort of forms and the things that I'm doing that are currently trying to prototype and experiment is not just new legal treaties and forms, but actually the way in which citizens and governments come together, the way in which formal and informal systems of authority and power collaborate and create this new future that we all need to sort of move to. And in Camden, we've got an experiment going, which is a prototype, and it's called Camden Community Pop-Up Think and Do Space, because the understanding that, again, my own journey is, we can't leave the thinking to the sort of strategists and to the intellectuals and to the academics alone, and the rest of us then just go away and implement what they come up with. If there's one big failure of the environment climate community, it is to have overinvested in the elite advocacy and in the use of reports and the use of evidence at a time when actually people were thirsty to be involved and wanted to participate and to actively choose and co-design and co-imagine their futures. And that's missed out in all of these modelling exercises and in all the way in which we talk about stakeholders and the public. So in Camden Think and Do, we've converted a disused cafe, which is on our high street, into a community action hub. You can come in, have a free cup of tea. In fact, it's very unusual because on most high streets you cannot walk in and not buy something. You're supposed to walk in and buy something. So the act of walking into a high street shop where there's nothing for sale other than your ideas and your connections and the way in which you're willing to talk to your fellow citizens and council staff who are present on many occasions, is the big ingredients that we're selling, is your imagination, your collaboration, your vision. And to sort of essentially, I think, move lots of people who want to move away, I think, from just protesting to doing, like how and what do I do and how can I find like-minded people who will be on this journey with me. So that's the latest sort of thing that I do. I want you to encourage those of you who are interested to come and talk to me, or let me know if you're interested in volunteering or running an event or running your own think and do space. And we're trying to get people to see actually that, you know, any space can be converted into an eco-action lab, you know, whether you have access to this room for an hour once a month, in your lunchtime, the foyer space can be converted. Everyone can convert existing assets and put them to use as a laboratory, as a connecting space, and to encourage all of those councils, for example, that most of the London councils have declared as well, to then figure out what is it that needs doing in your campus, in your life, in your street, in your the housing estate that you walk past every day, in your tube station, and to start literally from the ground beneath your feet to complement all of the other things that we're trying and doing and which need doing. So I want us to go away and find our niche in the system, but I think unless you find your feet and place yourself in community and collaborate with others and start imagining a different world, it's not going to happen. So I think I'm going to end it there, and I've used up quite a lot more time than the 30 minutes that I was supposed to, but yeah. I can stand, but yeah.
So we're going to have a I'll pass this mic around and try and make sure you speak into it. It won't change the noise in the room because we're recording it for YouTube video afterwards. So some questions, please.
I've got two. Is that working?
It won't face in the room because it's just recording afterwards. So.
Oh, I see. Okay. I've got two questions. One is, as regards civil disobedience or exile and so on, at what point do you think that can become counterproductive? I mean, when people were gluing themselves to the tube, it didn't seem to go down very well, but before that was the first demonstration when it seemed to be counterproductive. So that's one question. And then the other one is about who takes action. And governments, very slow to do anything for all sorts of reasons. Claire O'Neill has recently been sacked, and Boris has, said he's going to appoint a minister to the roughly. Do you think that will help or not? I mean, I saw commentary from African nations saying, having a minister, like a government person, sort of heading up and looking after COP26 would be good because, that's where the power is. But on the other hand, Boris and some of his perhaps people who will be part of the reshuffle haven't got that good green credentials, and obviously one will presume that Claire feels aggrieved about what's happened to her. So I was wondering what your view on all that is.
Yeah, sure. Shall I answer that? Because there were two questions, but maybe next time we'll do it in a sort of rounds of three. So because it's nice, and please feel free to make a comment or challenge something or whatever you feel is helpful. This is like your time. When can non-violent direct action be counterproductive? For me, there's a very clear boundary that the balance must be that you're inconveniencing yourself and that you're putting your own reputation, your own liberty at risk, and safety, obviously. Not other people's. That test is really important, and the test legally for some of the actions that XR did is disruption to the community. Like, is the disruption to the community so overwhelming that your right to protest has to sort of be curtailed? And XR is a young movement. It's really still, a baby in terms of these things. And I think not every action, was what I certainly agreed with. And, as as proved to be the case, lost a lot of popularity. I'm pretty clear that, really for the future, disrupting public transport wouldn't be my number one target, certainly not this time round. I think, disrupting ordinary people who are already in a really stressed environment, already in precarious, jobs in the economy, rushing from one gig economy to the next job is not what I think is the way to bridge social justice and to build community support. Having said that, I think there are painful lessons that were learned, and I hope that the people in XR who executed that will be chastened and realize that. And I think XR itself needs to evolve in terms of its own governance, because actually the hive mind was brilliant and most people within XR opposed that action, and still it went ahead. So I think there's a set of things about who decides what is an XR action, and so those things will evolve, and they have done. Many other NGOs have been through painful processes. So I don't want to beat XR up too much, but it's really the learning from that that's important. And I think for me that the learning from all over the world, the Gilets jaunes to the Chilean, people who came out in their millions, is that you can't ask, ordinary people to bear the brunt of the change in such an unjust way without providing real, proper alternatives. Just asking them to join your protest when they're doing that is a really bad thing. And I want to say also that, in many cases, many of those communities are at the forefront of taking action. So many of them have already been taking action on air pollution, many other things. So it's not like they don't care about the environment. They really care about the environment, actually. They're living in the dirtiest bits of it. They're exposed to the most toxic bits. So yeah, I feel like I hope that answers that. And I certainly think that there were some very brave people, and I salute and believe in non-violent disobedience continuing. But I think the targeting and the choice of place and who's involved really needs to be thought through. So on the COP minister thing, so look, after these 4 COPs, and I worked a lot with the presidencies of most of them, it's a hugely prestigious post, right? Because it's the country's entire image and their diplomatic standing is up there. And in this particular case, there's a lot to deliver as well. It's not like, there isn't a big responsibility here. So there's always a bit of a jockeying for power, and we have moved from a position where the presidency was not so important. Actually, the secretariat of the convention used to manage most of the negotiations, and the negotiators would manage most of the discussion. So as it were, the presidencies of the system has become more presidential. So the presidencies have started to matter more and more and more, and that wasn't always the case, 25 years ago. And I think it absolutely helps to have the heavyweight person. So they must have credibility within their own cabinet. So a senior ranking minister is essential, not someone who doesn't command the respect of their own cabinet colleagues in this case. I'm not saying that was the case with Claire Perry, but this is generally the thing. Someone who has the respect of every other country's minister. So they see them as equals, and there's this is really graded. So the environment ministers are not important ministers, frankly. What are the top 3 posts? Prime Minister, Treasury, Foreign Minister, then maybe Home Office. Then that's it. Nearly all countries, those are the top prizes. So you need that. And then in this particular case, having a minister who has no essential department really to support her and starting from scratch, I don't think that was a wise thing to do for me, because that means that those people are not then able to bring all their colleagues together. So the biggest impact actually on a host country is often radicalizing, organizing, coordinating their own country's machinery and then influencing that. So I don't want to go into whether Claire Perry herself, Claire O'Neill, was the right minister, the wrong minister. It's obvious now that there was a stitch up both before and there will be afterwards. And what I would say is kind of normal for there to being a lot of jockeying of power. And I hope that they get their act together. And, you know, the people who are in the running now don't, like I heard, well, Cameron's rejected it. There's Andrea Leadsom and Michael Gove. And Michael Gove, you know, who knows, but he's the minister who also gutted the curriculum of climate education. You know, so there's a lot of, you know, skepticism about the credibility of the team in place right now to really galvanize and motivate and inspire and really represent the best ideas. And I think the credibility of the UK, in the end, I would say the final, you know, in answer, the credibility of the UK will be, are you walking the walk? You know, to what extent have you committed to real, genuine, ambitious action? That's the highest level of ambition. That's what Paris requires as a legal standard. And, you know, us not meeting our third and fourth carbon budgets is, you know, the killer for everybody. Like, every country knows it. There's no point saying nice things about future dates of 2050 and phasing out ice by 2035 to 40 if you're not meeting your trajectories right now, and that's the killer test. And unless they announce very quick, who cares who is making that announcement, but unless they announce something very quickly to bridge that credibility gap, you know, we're not going to have the standing to encourage and cajole and, you know, command action from others. So I think there was this gentleman, and then there was two hands over there, and then maybe a third one.
Picking up on the fourth and fifth carbon budgets, we're not on course
Yeah,
to meet in breach of our own climate change act.
Yep.
Are you happy to give your weight and support to a coalition of legal agencies in Britain, in the same way that the Climate Litigation Network had such great success in Agenda in Britain, the Supreme Court also ruling that the government has got to meet those agendas? A client just started a case against Leadsom, is it how you pronounce her name? Andrea. For overruling and pressing ahead with the draft. The case I'm making, using your power and influence and specialist knowledge and wisdom, is that getting arrested can bring us the wrong branding to exile, when in fact, and what every magistrate seems to be saying to people who are going through the courts for breaches of traffic rules, is that you need to bring the government to court. So surely a strategy of offence, it should go in parallel with defence. And what Tessa Khan was saying from the Climate Litigation Network is that it needs to be supported and coordinated with mass mobilisation, sort of active. You know, the whole exile network can be used to amplify the guilt of the present buffoonery in government.
Yeah, great. Okay.
And
I heard you. Yeah.
Did everyone hear?
Yeah.
I'm one of the PhD students here.
Okay.
I'm one of the PhD students here in the DTP, and I mean, a lot of us wouldn't be here at Imperial doing PhDs on climate change if we weren't convinced that the vaccine played out. But my question is, how do you, knowing that it's been going on, how dire the situation is, and how we've been trying to do this for so long, how do you keep going?
Hi, this is quite an open question, so I'm happy for like quite a choice answer or quite selective setting. Basically, I was wondering your thoughts on sort of involving indigenous cultures and indigenous legal frameworks or structures that prioritise ecology, and how you think that could be integrated
Okay. Gosh, well, that's three great questions, and I'll try and answer them sort of to the best I can. So litigation is absolutely needed. I feel, again, in the UK, we've invested in litigation. And there was a big strategy fight, and the philanthropies, and I used to work in them, were prioritising essentially keeping the UK's leadership role intact. And so therefore didn't actually fund as much litigation because it would make the UK look crap, right? Because we were one of the few countries that had the net zero target. They didn't want to, fund that. And I feel actually it isn't the role of philanthropy, it's the role of, that we need money. Those cases need resourcing, and some of them have happened. Client Earth has taken loads and loads of litigation cases on air pollution, and many other things, many other cases successfully, and they've not implemented any of the things. So litigation isn't a sort of panacea, and it takes 5 to 10 years in many cases. So I turned myself, what could I do, rather than trying to raise money for another 5-year effort, piecemeal, whatever. I personally think, some of us lawyers need to invest in NVDA. You see, like, I'm a very strategic person. We can't all run around doing agenda type cases. The agenda decision is brilliant. It took, years. It took 5 years plus, actually, the planning of it. So, so that's my response. So I'm just speaking personally, and I support litigation, and I would encourage, and whatever network emerges, I'm absolutely for it and would be right there. But personally, I think, you need to use criminal law, you need to use all legal strategies, and litigation is just one strategy. Non-violent civil disobedience is another. And as I said, that was a missing ingredient, frankly, going on. And as I said, litigation will increase, and the more that it's powered and fueled by movements, the more likely it is to actually achieve the change. So that's what I would say. On how do I'll just deal with the other legal frameworks question. So I think, I've been reading more and more, and I'm really fascinated, and I think that the legal systems of indigenous peoples and of the commons, how we collectively manage, govern, own the commons, is far more interesting and isn't really represented in our system. So I'm more drawn to the rights of nature sort of frameworks, very different, actually. That's the new law that we want to move towards. But, we're moving from one system to another system, so I would love to have a longer conversation with you about that. And sometimes I feel like the concept of ecocide is actually in the old system. It's a punitive, punishing old system thing, and we need both. It's like vision and, the vision of where we're going to. So, I'm deeply humbled by the way in which many traditions have already been able to handle very well governing the commons through their legal norms, which are supplemented by lifestyles and all the rest of it. And we've got a lot of learning and catch up to do. And how do I keep going? I guess that's related. I don't always. I've had massive times, especially in the last few years, where I've felt really, really fragile and unable to function. And, part of my withdrawal from my own work in the climate space internationally was feeling very much like we'd failed, which we sort of have. That's kind of true. But, that's just the start of one more journey. And I guess what inspired me was seeing all of the young people, rising up. And also the communities and countries that I work with, frankly, for them, climate change is just one more mega problem that's been thrown their way. And they've never given up. And they've, in the end, been at the forefront of the very biggest struggles that have succeeded. So, my parents' generation, as I said, were people who overthrew colonialism. And I know that sounds a bit divisive, but I'm sure that took hundreds of years and, generations of effort. And, there were dark times and, very difficult moments for them. So I feel like the same with the suffragettes, the same with the anti-apartheid movement, the same with gay rights. I take comfort from that fact that people have worked solidly together for a long time, and actually change comes. And it's very difficult when you're in it to kind of know what the end point is. But when you look back, look where we are. Look at how much has been achieved. We've seen, the Berlin Wall fell. We've ended apartheid, and we've got, equality for women. It doesn't mean that there isn't yet more to do on all of those fronts, but we live in a very different world. And I feel almost the moment that we're now at is a sort of backlash of the most enormous kind against the completion of a vision that sees every human being as equal and as valid, and is really going to put the human rights of everyone in center stage of our systems. Like we've had a real mismatch and a real contradiction between our ideals of human rights and civil liberties, but managed to only have them for a certain bit of the world or for certain people. So yeah, that keeps me going, that our vision is becoming more complete, and we're more connected, and we're all the scientific genius here is, and elsewhere, and all the wisdoms of the world are now more connected and able to get us there. But let's not kid ourselves that it's all going to happen in a year or 2 years. It's about creating, as I said, communities and connections that are resilient to the fact that we will never know when we've won. So that sort of keeps me going, and it's a little bit and doing fun things like setting up pop-ups, where you collaborate with people and just imagine what can be done right now together. You have enormous agency, enormous power. We're enormously privileged. All of you doing a PhD have, enormous knowledge, expertise, and experience that you can start using tomorrow in whatever way. So I hope that answers your question a bit, and I hope that some of you here, if you want to launch a pop-up in a month or two, we're going to try and roll these things out, because they're quite cool things to do and organise.
Fantastic. So there's some public question after the scenario.